So my talk today, as suggested, is on postgraduate earnings and the gender wage gap in Canada. There we go. This project is guided by four main research research questions. The first one being, does a postgraduate education improve one's likelihood of being employed? The second, how have wage premiums for a postgraduate degree changed over time? Third, does the gender wage gap change at higher levels of education? And finally, what are the sources of women's lower earnings at the master's and doctorate level of education? So some of the motivation for this project was that the fact that over the last 3 decades, we have witnessed a remarkable growth in higher education in most developed countries. In particular, Canada has witnessed a considerable increase in post-secondary education and is one of the most highly educated countries in the world. While much of this increase has actually occurred at the college and undergraduate levels, there has also been a considerable increase in the numbers of young adults enrolling in master's and doctorate programs in Canada. And one of the important factors contributing to this growth in postgraduate education is the belief that a postgraduate education might actually be the new bachelor's degree, which I found in some of the literature I was reviewing. And that there's this sort of expectation that a postgraduate education will lead to better employment outcomes and economic returns. The expansion of higher education is also often attributed to labor market demand for highly skilled workers and an increasingly knowledge-driven global economy. However, there's been a lack of recent research on postgraduate labor market outcomes, including how economic returns to postgraduate education may have changed over time. As a result, this study that I'm conducting is going to fill this gap in the literature by exploring returns to postgraduate education for early mid-career graduates in Canada. The growth in postgraduate education has also been gendered. Women have made considerable gains in master's and doctorate education. And as I will show you on the next slides, based on Statistics Canada data from the last 3 decades, women have increased their enrollment numbers in master's programs by nearly 129% and by 182% at the doctorate level over the last 3 decades. Some studies also suggest that a postgraduate education will help narrow the gender wage gap, which is why that's also a component of this study. So here I'll show you, this is a figure that I made. There's a lot of information that I'm going to be showing you. And so I wanted, for 2 reasons, I guess, take a moment to explain what I'm going to show you. And also, I guess I want to take a moment with this because of the enormous amount of time that I spent putting this figure together. So as you will see, this figure is going to show enrollment rates over the last 3 decades, starting from the 1992 to 1993 academic year, all the way to the 2016 to 2017 academic year. Along the x-axis here, you'll see that there's going to be sort of 6 components that I'm going to show you, which is the BA, MA, and PhD levels of enrollment, and separated as well by gender. On the y-axis, you'll see that on this side, these are the BA enrollment numbers. So it's important to note, it's kind of hard to, at first glance, to distinguish, but this actually ranges from 0 to 600,000. And on this axis here is the MA and PhD enrollment numbers, but this ranges from 0 to only 120,000. So it's something you got to discern a little bit when you're looking at this. Sorry, there's someone still trying to come in. So I will show you. First, these are the male BA enrollment numbers over time. And so you can see there's sort of been this increase over the last 3 decades of from approximately just under 300,000 annually to over 400,000 now. But if you look at women's BA enrollment numbers, they are substantially higher. The growth curve is larger, and they also significantly outpace men across all of these years. And then again, there's this sort of nice line of, educational expansion leading to more men enrolling in master's programs. So I'm showing you these enrollment numbers. The men have increased their enrollment in master's. But women have also significantly outpaced men at the MA level, which has been, I guess, great for them. I don't know. Now I'm showing you this line here at the bottom, which is enrollment rates for men in PhD programs. And so again, you can see that this has increased over time, but I should point out that these estimates are based on this axis. So this increase has only been from about, say, 18,000 annually to about 23 or 24,000 annually. There has also been an increase in women's PhD enrollment numbers, but this has remained lower than men. And I guess this is sort of like the anomaly in the higher education, whereby women outpace men in all levels of sort of higher education, except at the doctorate level. And so I also want to just quickly point out some descriptive numbers that I pulled from Statistics Canada as well. So I'm looking at these sort of mean income estimates for 2018. These estimates are based on new graduates entering the labor market 2 years after graduation. And so the average unadjusted numbers, I guess, not accounting for gender differences or any other sort of demographic or demographic variations or other factors. At the bachelor's degree level, people are earning approximately $57,400 annually. Those with a master's degree are earning approximately $74,900, and then those with a doctoral degree are earning $84,400 on average. And so what these represent are a 30% premium at the master's level. So for those getting a master's versus just a bachelor's degree, they're actually earning 30% more than their counterparts with just a bachelor's degree. Those earning a doctoral degree actually earn an additional 13% earnings premium over their counterparts who have a master's degree. So there is sort of this earnings premium still for postgraduate education, which is likely the driving force behind why people continue to enroll in these postgraduate programs at an increasing rate over time. And so other factors that contribute to this sort of growing number of postgraduate education enrollments include the fact that, as I already mentioned, higher education expansion is often attributed to this sort of labor market demand for highly skilled workers. In other words, rising educational requirements are determined by the increasingly complex functional needs of jobs. Recognizing this demand, students invest in postgraduate education, obtaining advanced skills and training, which they hope will improve their employability and earnings after graduation. One potential consequence of the expansion of higher education may be a declining demand for workers with lower levels of education. This process supports the technological function theory, which would predict that returns to postgraduate education have increased over time. An alternative explanation suggests that there has been an oversupply of highly educated workers, which has allowed employers to raise minimum standards regardless of the credentials or training required for a particular job. This is referred to as degree inflation, which suggests that employers may not require higher credentials, but are supplied with an overeducated labor market, allowing them to raise these requirements. This scenario would predict that returns to postgraduate education would actually decline over time. But whether the expansion of higher education has been supply or demand driven, past studies have generally found that possessing a master's or doctorate degree does improve employment outcomes relative to those with lower levels of education. However, there is less research exploring how these returns to master's and doctorate degrees have changed over time. There has also been relatively little research on whether the gender wage gap attenuates at the highest levels of education in Canada. As I showed you with the enrollment figures, women outnumber men in bachelor's and master's degree enrollment and attainment in Canada. Women have also, over time, narrowed enrollment gaps at the doctorate level. These gains in higher education have allowed women to enter occupations that would otherwise be barred to them because they lacked the prerequisite credentials. The gender desegregation of higher education and traditionally male occupations has contributed to an increase in women's earnings and the attenuation of the gender wage gap. Although limited research has explored whether the gender wage gap narrows at the highest levels of education. There are some studies which suggest that the wage gap is smaller at the doctorate level. Moreover, in the United States, researchers have found that although the wage gap has declined over the last 30 years, the attenuation of the wage gap is actually slower at the top of the wage distribution. This further supports the need to explore how the wage gap may change at the highest levels of education in Canada. Now, I'm going to just refer back to one of my research questions, which was the fourth one, and that's addressing the sort of sources of the gender wage gap. So in order to identify these sources of women's lower earnings at the postgraduate level and address my fourth research question, the study also examines gender differences in returns to marriage and parenthood, which have important implications for labor market outcomes. So marriage can signal stability, commitment, and responsibility to employers, which translates to wage premiums in the labor market. However, due in part to the gender division of labor in the household, which contributes to women doing a disproportionate share of household chores, marriage can actually negatively affect employers' perceptions of married women's productivity, which may explain why current research shows that men receive much larger wage premiums for being married than women. Parenthood also serves as a signal of productivity and competence. However, motherhood actually disadvantages women. Motherhood can lead to the devaluation of women's productivity and perceived competence in the labor market. These perceptions of productivity lead to lower wages for women, even when controlling for hours worked and other measures of productivity. The motherhood penalty also varies across the wage distribution. For example, the motherhood penalties are significantly smaller for women at the higher end of the wage distribution. So for example, higher levels of education may allow women to sort into occupations that provide family-friendly workplace benefits, i.e. extended health benefits or maternity leave, more autonomy and flexibility in their work schedules, which may reduce work-life conflict and improve their productivity and earnings. And so higher incomes may also allow women to outsource their childcare and housekeeping, reducing the disproportionate share of these responsibilities that fall to women in heterosexual relationships. So the gender differences in returns to marriage and parenthood are important sources of women's lower earnings, and so that's important to examine as motherhood disadvantages women, but men typically receive large fatherhood bonuses or premiums when they have children. These fatherhood premiums appear to be largest for college-educated married men in households with traditional gender divisions of labor, who also work in sort of professional or managerial jobs that are emphasize cognitive skills and abilities rather than physical strength. However, marriage and parenthood premiums have changed over time, as well as by degree type. But this has almost been entirely neglected in the literature. And so this is an important omission, given that the gender differences in returns to marriage and parenthood are such important sources of women's lower earnings. I'm going to get into my methodology now. This study draws on confidential microdata from the 1981 to 2016 long-form Canadian census, which was assessed at one of Statistics Canada's research data centers, which both has some pros and cons, some of which I'll outline in a subsequent slide. The Canadian census is a cross-sectional survey designed to collect demographic, education, and labor market information from the entire adult population living in private dwellings, including all provinces and territories. The census is administered every 5 years, with 25% of the population receiving the long-form census. And so a total of 8 cycles between 1981 and 2016 are used to explore cross-sectional differences in the returns to postgraduate education, as well as the gender wage gap. The analytic sample for the study is limited to individuals holding either a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate degree between the ages of 25 and 44. The sample is restricted to that age group in order to allow respondents sufficient time to complete postgraduate training, as well as to focus the analyses on recent and early to mid-career graduates. Those residing in sparsely populated Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut are excluded because their labor markets in these areas are very different from the rest of Canada. I also exclude respondents who are currently enrolled in school, whether or not they're sort of combining part-time employment with school. These respondents were excluded as they have sort of a tangential relationship with the labor market. And then for the wage gap models I'm going to show you, we also exclude anyone who is unemployed and those who earn less than $1,000 annually, as again, these people have less of an attachment to the labor market. This study uses 2 response variables. The first is a dichotomous variable of whether respondents are either employed or unemployed or not in the labor market. The second is the natural logarithm of total weekly employment income adjusted to 2015 dollars, which reflects the annual earnings reported on the 2016 census. Total employment income includes income from wages, salaries, and self-employment income. Weekly income is calculated by dividing annual income by the number of weeks worked in a given year. There's also 2 focal explanatory variables. The first one being degree type, so either a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate degree, as well as a binary measure of gender, so male or female. And then I also include several control measures. There's various demographic controls, including age squared, marital status, presence of children in the household, province of residence, residing in a census metropolitan area with a population greater than 100,000, bilingualism, immigrant status, visible minority, and Aboriginal status. And then additionally, there's labor market control variables, which include hours worked, self-employment, occupation, industry, and whether respondents held an academic job at the professor or lecturer, as a professor or lecturer. For an analytic strategy, I actually use different analytic techniques to answer each of the 4 research questions. So to answer the first question, which asks whether postgraduate education increases one's likelihood of being employed, multivariate logistic regression is used with the dependent variable being employed versus unemployed or not in the labor market. For the remaining research questions, the natural logarithm of total weekly employment income is used as a dependent variable. To answer the second question, which asks whether there are wage premiums for having a postgraduate degree and whether returns to postgraduate education have changed over time, multivariate ordinary least squares regression is used to identify wage premiums for holding a postgraduate credential relative to a bachelor's degree. OLS regression is also used to answer the third question, which asks whether the gender wage gap is reduced for women with master's and doctoral degrees relative to those with a bachelor's degree. The final research question focuses on the sources of women's lower earnings. The first step in this process includes identifying the gender differences in returns to marriage and parenthood premium using gender stratified OLS regression models by degree type. Next, I use an Owaka-Blinder decomposition to further identify sources of pay differentials by postgraduate degree type. An Owaka-Blinder decomposition divides wage differentials between two groups, so say males and females, into a portion that is explained by group differences in the control variables, such as the demographic controls and employment factors that I mentioned, and a residual part that cannot be accounted for by such differences in wage determinants. The final part, this unexplained part, is often used as a measure for discrimination. So essentially, what I did was I ran separate decomposition models for each degree type, which then provides a raw difference in the gender wage gap. The coefficients can be converted into percentages. For example, say a 25% gender wage gap at the bachelor's level in 2016. Then the model identifies how much of this percentage is explained by each of the control variables included in the model. For example, age differences might explain 3% of this difference in the gender wage gap. After you add up the different portions of the difference that are explained by the control variables, you're ultimately left with an unexplained portion of the difference, which can be attributed to unobserved factors, such as gender discrimination. And I'll outline that a little bit more. And so to look at the likelihood of employment, unfortunately, because I'm using RDC data, it's difficult to go in and just do small changes. So I'm gonna have to show you this table that I know is gonna be a lot to look at, but it's the only table you're gonna have to look at, I promise. And so this is an odds ratio from a logistic, these are odds ratios from logistic regression. Determining whether there's a difference in the likelihood of employment versus unemployment by gender as well as degree type. For those who aren't familiar with this, numbers lower than 1 represent lower odds of employment, whereas numbers higher than 1 represent a higher likelihood of employment versus unemployment. And so if you look at sort of panel A here, it appears that men with a master's degree relative to a bachelor's degree actually have lower likelihoods of employment over time. And this has sort of been consistent over time, that they're approximately somewhere between 22 and 30% less likely than their bachelor's degree counterparts to be employed. At the doctorate level, there's actually no real difference over time, except in the more recent years, they're almost 20% less likely to be employed compared to those with a bachelor's degree. For women, these outcomes are very different. In almost all, well, in the earlier, I guess, census years, their likelihood of employment was actually much higher compared to those women with a bachelor's degree. But that has actually now, the returns to these sort of postgraduate credentials have actually attenuated quite a bit, and they're actually not seeing these gains anymore. At the doctorate level for women, again, the postgraduate returns have decreased from being 2 times as likely to now being only about 16% more likely to be employed compared to those with a bachelor's degree. And so this is sort of like a general trend, I guess, in the returns to postgraduate education, that for women, their likelihood of employment has actually been decreasing over time. In panel B, I'll just quickly describe. Basically, this is showing difference in the likelihood of employment for women compared to men. And so if you see all of these numbers here, they're all, I don't know, approximately 50% less likely than men to be employed at any of these levels of education. And so there is this definitive sort of gender difference in returns to these sort of higher level credentials. Now we're going to look at some wage premiums. This figure here shows wage premiums for either a master's or doctorate degree relative to a bachelor's degree over time and for men. And so you'll see from in 1981 and sort of these early 1980s, there's significant returns to either getting a master's degree or a master's degree or a doctorate degree. But these returns over time have actually substantially decreased. And so now, moving from 1981 to all the way to 2016, men earning a master's degree are actually only earning 2% more than those with a bachelor's degree. And there's actually no difference for men earning a doctoral degree versus having just a master's degree. For women, these returns have remained, I guess, more consistent, but they have also decreased over time. And so again, these sort of wage premiums for investing in a postgraduate education have been declining over time. So for example, women earning a doctorate degree in 1981 earned a wage premium of 29%, whereas now they're only earning a wage premium of 8%. And to further look at this sort of gender wage gap, I'm showing you a figure here which compares the earnings of women's earnings at the different levels of education, so at either a bachelor's degree, master's degree, or doctorate degree, relative to that of their male counterparts. And so in the early 80s, you'll see that at all levels of education, women are earning significantly less than their male counterparts. And this sort of was maintained into the 90s, at which point the gender wage gap actually started to attenuate. And most interestingly, what I'm going to show you, I guess, is that here on this end, sorry about that, in 2016, women with a doctorate degree are not earning significantly less or more than men. And so there is a sort of estimated 2% difference, but those results are not statistically significant, and therefore, I guess one could argue that the earnings of male and female doctoral degree graduates are comparable now, 2016, which is encouraging for sure. This figure here shows the marriage premium received by both male and females over time. So the left side shows the marriage premiums for men, and then the right side shows the marriage premiums for women. And so the takeaway is sort of that while these premiums have been decreasing over time for men, women at no point, there has been no point where women have actually earned the same sort of marriage premiums that men are earning. In fact, in some years, they're actually earning a marriage penalty, although the results are not overly significant. This figure here shows Parenthood premiums, so separated again by males and females, by degree type, and then over time. One important omission is in 1981, the Canadian Census didn't ask whether men had children. They only asked if women had children. And so there's this gap in in these results, unfortunately, but why is that jumping around? Over time, men continue to receive a significant parenthood premium, as observed in the sort of left-hand side of this panel. You can see that in 1986, they're earning 13% more at the bachelor's degree level compared to those who are don't have children, I guess. And then this premium has sort of maintained over time. And in 2016, men with a bachelor's degree, master's degree, or doctoral degree are actually earning a 10% wage premium over not having children. This relationship is very different for women. In almost all years, they're showing a negative wage premium at most levels of education, particularly at the bachelor's and master's degree level. But at the doctorate degree level, there's actually no sort of there's not a significant change, I guess, in their earnings, which is encouraging and sort of supports what I was saying in terms of the fact that at higher levels of education and people going into the higher wage distribution areas, they might actually be able to afford ways to sort of prevent these negative ramifications to their earnings. Finally, I'm going to go over my wage decomposition. And so showing you figures or tables is going to be overly complex. I'm not going to try to do that, as it shows a lot, as it's a lot to take in for someone who's not particularly familiar. But what I'll sort of explain is that these are the factors that are explaining the majority of the difference in the gender wage gap across all years and across all levels of education. And the percentage of the wage gap has actually also changed as well, including the sort of unexplained sort of gender discrimination portion. And so, for example, in 1991 at the bachelor's degree level, women were earning almost 37% less than men. This number has declined between 1981 to 2016, whereas women at the bachelor's level are earning only about 21% less than men with a bachelor's degree. The unexplained portion has also decreased from nearly 20% to only 13%. And so there's sort of this 13% of whatever I was, the variables that I included in these gender wage decompositions could not explain approximately 13% of the raw difference in the gender wage gap at this level. For doctorate degrees, again, the raw difference in earnings between men and women has decreased from almost 34% in 1981 to approximately 10% in 2016. And the unexplained portion has also significantly decreased from nearly 28% in 1981 to just above 3%. So only about 3% of the difference at the doctorate degree level is unexplained by sort of differences in characteristics and labor market attachments, I suppose, like hours worked, occupation, as well as industry. So in summary, likelihood of employment at the master's and doctorate education level has decreased men's likelihood of being employed relative to holding a bachelor's degree. For women, postgraduate education typically increases their odds of being employed, especially at the doctorate level. Women are also less likely to be employed than men, but this is slightly weaker for women with a master's and doctorate degree. The important sort of speculative component here is that why men are earning, or sorry, not earning, but are less likely to be employed at the master's and doctorate degree level relative to the bachelor's degree. Speculatively, I would say possibly due to the sort of supply and demand of these different credentials. But I mean, I would love to hear some insights as to why this could possibly be. It's not something that I've been able to fully uncover in terms of the literature to explain how men investing in these postgraduate credentials continue to have lower likelihoods of employment. And for wage premiums for having a master's or doctorate are generally larger for women, but have declined for both sexes since 1981. Although the gender wage gap declined over the last 30 years, women continue to earn less than men across nearly all levels of education, except at the doctorate level in 2016, which I suggest, that there's no sort of statistical, or there's no significant difference in the doctorate gender wage gap in 2016. And then I'm also summarizing sort of these wage premiums to marriage and parenthood. So gender differences in marriage and parenthood returns continue to advantage men but disadvantage women. However, this has declined over time, and there's sort of no evidence of motherhood penalties for early to mid-career women with doctorate degrees. Age differences, work hours, occupations, and industry explain the greatest portion of women's lower earnings across all levels of education. And that's it.
That is great, Anthony. Please join me in applauding Anthony for a great talk. I would like to open the floor for questions and or feedback for Anthony's ongoing project. Okay, maybe I'll get started with one so that everybody can get warmed up a little bit. So Anthony, your analysis are conducted for people between the ages of 25 and 44. And I wanted you to talk to me a little bit about what considerations you gave for the right censoring problem that you may have by restricting your analysis to people between the ages of 25 to 44, and whether or not you feel that the lower employment rates of individuals with a master's or a doctoral degree is potentially attributed by the fact that you're including people in their late 20s, mid and late 20s.
Sure. The decision to sort of restrict that age group, I guess, is mostly in order to establish a cohort that where these individuals are earning these different credentials around the same time frame. And so to compare, say, an early to mid-career adult, somewhere around the age of 30, to a well-established individual, say, at the height of their career, sort of would, I guess, skew the results of these wage premiums over time. And so that was, I guess, the main reason to restrict it, to, like, I guess, exclude those groups. And then, sorry, what was the second portion of your question?
So potentially what I'm alluding at and it's disguised as a question, is the fact that when we look at differences in, say, something like wage premiums for college graduates or people with the BA, or we look at school completion for people with the BA, the age cutoff that we're using is about 25. And the fact that you're including people with a master's degree or a doctorate degree, but using the same cutoff point, suggests that some of the findings that you are having a hard time placing may be the product of the fact that your age restriction may be a little bit too young. So I think it's wonderful that you found an age group to compare the different years, but I think it's a little bit too young, given the fact that BA is used for 25 and older, right? So that's basically the question disguised, the comment disguised as a question. Okay?
Yes, I agree. And so that was sort of a consideration that going into this project. I guess in a way, there's sort of always going to be this selection effect in terms of the age group you're selecting, or the results being skewed because you're not including people. But I tried to minimize that as much as possible by making because I'm looking at postgraduate education, and by making the sort of requirement or the entry into that being a bachelor's degree. I tried, like that was my attempt at minimizing sort of these any sort of selection effects that might have come up. But yes, I agree. I could have potentially increased that age to give a larger portion of the population time to earn a postgraduate education and then assess their differences in employment and earnings.
Yeah, there are quite a
Thank
few
you.
studies that are looking at wage differentials for MAs or older that are using the cutoff point 30. So that's something that you may consider. Patrick.
Thanks, Anthony. That was great and really interesting. And it's always great to hear of the research our grads are doing. I wanted to ask, and you touched on it a little bit towards the end, but I was really struck by your findings about sort of the lower odds of employment among men and sort of the shrinking wage premium among men with graduate degrees versus bachelor's degrees, right? I mean, that's sort of inconsistent, I think, with the at least expectations that you set up in the beginning, right? That not only are we seeing expansion of education, but you know, increasingly jobs are requiring more than the bachelor's degree, right? So we'd assume, or sort of my hypothesis going in would be that if you've got an MA or PhD, you should be more employable than if you've just got a bachelor's degree, at least in sort of more recent years. So again, you started to talk a little bit about it at the end of your presentation, but I'm wondering if you have any sort of other ideas about what might be going on there and why sort of that finding might not fit with expectations. I have an idea, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, I'm excited to hear what your idea is, but I guess I think, like I alluded to, I think it has to do with like a supply and demand situation where people continue to invest in increasingly higher levels of education, and there may be this sort of increasing in complexity in the types of work that are available in the labor market. But there's this dichotomy of employers being able to, I guess, require higher levels of education without actually needing those particular job skills. That's kind of where my head's at in terms of trying to disentangle that. But I agree, it's not what you would expect, and I don't have a very clear answer as to how that might be the case.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to say thanks. And for what it's worth, my initial thought is that perhaps you're sort of picking up on like a cohort effect. So, right, you showed really compellingly in the beginning that first figure about how especially MA degrees are becoming more common, both among men and among women. And so as those folks enter the labor market they sort of enter the labor market later, but with a higher degree, and you're sort of comparing them, especially in the later years, to folks who might have a BA, but more experience, and who might be older. That kind of makes sense? So I guess similar, to Kate's point, towards the end, you're comparing younger workers with higher education to older workers with less education who might earn more just by virtue of having more experience.
Yeah, that could definitely be a factor. You know, that individuals with a bachelor's degree have already spent 3 or 4 or 5 years on the labor market. Their employment outcomes could be, or the likelihood of their employment could very easily be more likely than, you know, a brand new postgraduate graduate. That's actually a good point. Thank you.
Abby.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask, I know that it probably might be a different project altogether, but I was wondering if you thought of including sexual minorities or other gender identities into this project as you move forward with it, if you plan on doing that.
I would be very open to that. limitation to that is this wouldn't be able to, it wouldn't be something that could be assessed over time, as those types of questions weren't asked on the 1981 Canadian census. I don't even think there's actually, that's even asked now. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm definitively can say that I wouldn't be able to look at that over time. It would be interesting to sort of, I guess, maybe use some extra data to do like a cross-sectional, more recent cohort and look at different various factors. That could be a neat added element to this project. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Anthony or feedback? Yes, Patrick.
I was just typing you a note, Kate, but I don't want to hog the conversation, but I do have a couple sort of just clarifying questions. I'm curious what you think maybe about the like variation among the degree types, right? Because you know, so that's sort of a two-part. First, when you're talking about doctorate degrees, are you including PhDs, JDs, MDs all together, or focused really just on the PhD?
So that was sort of something I battled with in terms of this presentation, and I wanted to sort of limit my time explaining my methodology. I actually do exclude professional degree graduates because their labor market outcomes are very different. Their earnings are very different than other types of education. And so the doctorate graduates here are anyone who earned like an actual PhD versus like a medical degree and so forth. And so they are excluded.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yoko?
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's a very interesting work, and very in-depth and very engaging with different hypotheses, and then showing a very interesting trend. But in terms of the employment, the gap between men and women, and also the consequences of a gender gap in earnings. I was also wondering if you could maybe consider or look into, or maybe I missed, but then in terms of the feminization of certain industry. So as the proportion of more women are getting higher education and pursuing the higher levels of education, as you portrayed in the earlier part of the graphs. Those graduates are not necessarily evenly distributed into all occupations or all industries. So certain occupations have a higher demands, or the proportion of female workers in certain occupation and industry are disproportionate. And so I was kind of wondering that over time, the feminization of certain sectors or industry or jobs might be kind of like changing, and that could potentially explaining the closing gap in terms of gender for the employability. So I was kind of wondering, like, this is something that you could take and unpack those like control variables that you had in terms of industry and job sectors.
That's an interesting perspective. I do control for different types of industry and different occupations. I don't necessarily unpack the sort of distribution of gender in these different occupations, but I guess what I'm leaning on is sort of existing literature, which sort of suggests that because of the inroads that women are making at the higher levels of education, there's a desegregation in the labor market. And so that's sort of, I'm just taking that as like I suppose at a face value, but it would be an interesting element to actually add to see where these sort of different types of credentials are ending up in terms of industry, as well as over time. I mean, it'd be neat to sort of look at the gender distribution by the industry type over time. Yeah, thank you.
So if I am able to add to some of Yoko's point, I think an interesting extension of that particular idea is to actually unpack for your dependent variable for employment. You're looking at employed versus not employed, right? and you're collapsing not in the labor market and unemployed, right? But what we do know based on the literature on the motherhood track or the mommy penalty, right, is the fact that a lot of women are also dropping out of the labor market. So that may be something that you may be able to disentangle and apply to your analysis.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you.
Any other questions? We have time for one more. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Okay, on that wonderful note, please join me once again and thank Anthony for a wonderful talk. And I also look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks when Marcy Carlson gives her talk. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.